Okay, well, today I have the great honour of chatting to Michael Cashman, actor, activist, and politician, and also writer. And I didn't know, Michael, until I read your book, that you were also a writer, but not only a writer of prose, but a writer of plays as well. So we'll come on to all of that. I loved reading your book. I thought it was fantastic. And it starts in a way which is so evocative of your upbringing in the East End. I lived a little bit in the East End myself. So some of the things you were talking about there was fantastic. And I was just struck by the vividness of your upbringing in the East End in the post-war period. And I just wondered whether you felt today, looking back, at what you've done over the years, your acting career, your activism, your political activism, what you would say was really rooted in your upbringing. Would you say that still influenced you today?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's lovely to see you, even at Zoom's.
Yeah, yeah.
And in that description of me, you forgot to leave out that also for some people I'm a pain in the neck, and for some people I'm glad I am.
It gets you a long way, though.
It does. I always say, Paul, my wonderful late husband, he always used to say, now there's an easy way of doing this, or there's a hard way. I'm absolutely rooted in how I was brought up, which is why I've been so honest about what happened to me, not only during those early years, but subsequently my teenage years, because unless you own the past, and especially the darker elements of the past, if you don't own them, they will end up owning and directing you.
Yeah.
And what I remember most from my past was that you had to stand up for yourself.
Yes.
Children were told you should be seen and not heard, but your place within a family structure in abiding by the rules. And my nan, my paternal nan, Mag, wonderful woman, deaf, wore a hearing aid when the women used to wear it and the men used to wear it on their belt, and she'd be turning it up and she'd get feedback, and she used to have a wonderful phrase. Two phrases, actually. She used to say, if I'm right, I'll die at their feet. And the other brilliant one that she used to say was, never let them play skittles with you. And it's a lovely idea of all these skittles lined up and somebody bowls you over. And my dad, he was a docker, worked on the docks, had a tough life. My mum, an office cleaner. And when my youngest brother was in a fight outside the flats, my dad didn't lean out of the window and say, stop. My dad leaned out the window and said, hit him back. And that was how you were brought up in those 50s. It was tough. It was rough. And if you couldn't look after yourself, then you were going nowhere.
Yeah, you get a really strong sense from reading the book of that, of you being a fighter and learning that in that world, in your upbringing. And I think you get a strong sense of that throughout the book, really. But you say you talk as well about some of the darker aspects of your youth, and I was really struck because you talk about your school years and how you were, a difficult student, let's say, until you discover acting, when it all changes for you. There's a sort of real passion that comes from that, and a real sense of you finding what you're passionate about. And, there's pretty immediate success that comes from that. But that brings quite a lot of darkness with it as well, it seems to me.
Yes, it does. But it's interesting that you talk about that, because I'm an example of where failure can lead you. I failed my 11 plus. If I passed my 11 plus, interestingly, I didn't even know what I was taking. If I passed my 11 plus, I wouldn't have gone on the trajectory, the career path that I've been on. It would have been very, very different. So there's a brilliant example for me of my philosophy that I don't believe in the concept of failure as a negative. Failure for me is proof that someone has tried to change something, to do something. differently or for the better. And so when I went to this school, and I knew at the earliest age that I was, well, we called it then queer. The title of the book, if they thought you were queer, they used to say, I think he's one of them.
One of them.
And so when I discovered drama, or show business, as we called it, at the age of 11, I found a world where I could belong, where I could be different, where I could be me. And maybe because I did know I was gay, that I took to acting more readily in order to disguise who I was. And that incredible luck of, impersonating Eartha Kitt, and then that scout.
In your cocktail dress.
Yeah, in my mum's cocktail dress, and I didn't tell her. And as I recount in the book, there in the school assembly, they bring me on as Eartha Kitt, and she stands up and she shouts out, "Here, he's got my cocktail dress on." I don't think she'd ever been to a cocktail party.
But she had the dress.
Yeah. She had the dress. That was my mum all over. She was ready.
So there's a bit in the book where you talk about your dad responding to that and saying, there's a lot of queers in that world.
Yes, that's right.
So what did that make you, do you remember how that made you feel at the time? Was that a positive thing for you?
Yeah, it made me feel really interested in getting very, very, very quickly into show business. And again, a world where it was interesting. And I say this in the book. When we described, even at the age of 12, 13, ourselves as queer, you'd say, "Are you queer?" Whereas when people used it as a derogative term, it was "you queer."
Yeah.
It had a hit. It had a not. And so it shows you how language, once used and intoned differently, can be used to kind of free you up. But when my dad said that they're full of queers, I thought, yes, that's where I want to be.
You knew what you wanted. So there's a sort of this sort of phase in the book. I was really struck by this because you speak very, very candidly and openly about some of the kind of, the predatory men really that were part of that world really, and what that meant for you. Because there are a number of examples in the book where you describe, either encounters or relationships which you would describe as abusive, I guess, in the language that you use today. And you're really frank and open about that. And I just wondered how what that meant to you to write that in the book.
I knew that if I didn't put it in, I would be dishonest, and I would pay a huge disservice to the people who've loved me throughout my life, and have got Paul, who I was with for 31 years. I said to him, actually, I said, "Do you realise we've been together 31 years?" He went, "Good God, that's longer than my inside leg. Go away." But when you've experienced what I experienced, and that you have to find mechanisms to cope and survive, you often, I dealt with the fact that if you loved me, you had to hurt me. And if you didn't hurt me, you didn't love me. And if you really loved me, you would hurt me and leave me. And Paul had the amazing patience. There were 13 years difference between us. And when he and I met, not only was the age of consent 21, but he and I were illegal for 3 years of our relationship together. And he had the patience, the dogged patience, to convince me that I was worthy of being loved and that I could love. And so that darker part, the abuse and the systematic abuse and the way my parents were either oblivious to it or didn't understand the world in which I operated, so that man who was supposed to be my manager arranged it so that I ended up living with him. And it's interesting in the book how I was going off to spend the weekend with him and his wife and children. And there was no wife and there were no children. And that began a process that went on for years. But it's there. And the reason I deal with these is to say to people, it's not enough. If we can be survivors, it's brilliant, but we've got to be victors. We've got to say, despite what happens in one's life, we can become our true selves. And central to that, and then I'll shut up, is the capacity to love and be loved, because it's the only thing that sustains in the end, the only thing.
I want to talk to you about when you met Paul and your relationship with him, because before I do that, just one thing which I was struck by. You're a successful actor at this point. You've got a TV career, you've got a film career, and you decide, actually, I don't want to do that. What I really want to do is to be a doctor. Now, actually, my neighbour in Stephanie said to me that she was your neighbour when you were growing up, and she said you wanted to be a doctor. And so when I saw this in the book, it struck me. And what I think is extraordinary is the single-mindedness with which you pursued that, because you decided that was actually your direction. You weren't you weren't at all equipped to do it in terms of preparation or qualifications, and yet, the dedication and drive that you brought to that is quite striking. And I get that sense in the book at a number of points, that when you commit to something, you commit wholeheartedly to it. There's a sense of full engagement, really. Why did that happen?
Well, I think the full engagement is a bit like it's an obsessive.
Yeah.
Right. So you go, I have to do that, and I apply that to things that really matter in my life, and often to things that don't. But when I left school, I mean, my schooling really finished, proper schooling, finished at the age of 12 when I walked away from my secondary modern school and ended up in a stage school.
Yeah.
And I left school at the age of 15 with no qualifications except sing, dance, impersonate, and act. And that's what I went off and did. But when I was 25 and I experienced those two doctors bringing that woman back to life, when I was visiting my then wonderful man I was having a long-term affair with, it just burned itself, etched itself into my memory. That sense again of belonging, of being needed, perhaps. Yeah. And so I just thought, okay, I'm 25. I'm on the edge of inadmissibility of getting into a medical school. So how can I do it? And how can I do it within a truncated period? And so that's what I set out to do. And having decided to do that, you can't throw yourself half measure at something if it's life-changing and if you want to do it. If you want to do it, throw all that you can at it. But Jeremy, again, it woke my eyes up to the fact that somebody said to me I could have done chemistry, physics, biology, physics not very well, I hasten to and got close to getting into medical school. Someone said that to me when I was 15, I would have said, you're mad. But when you need to do something, when you have that drive and that aspiration and that ambition, it can change who you are, but it signals for me the absolute necessity to be able to engage in lifelong learning, because we each achieve our potential at different ages to other people, depending on the experience of life that we have. And it was out of that I learned the discipline to be able to write.
Well, you were a playwright in Scarborough in 1982, early 1983, which is when you went into the ballroom at a local hotel and saw a photograph of a redcoat who you seemed to me you immediately fell in love with as soon as you saw the photo.
Joe, if I'm honest, I fell into lust with. I looked at that photograph and I thought, my God, and I did a double take. And I thought, he's gorgeous. And we should tell people what a redcoat is.
Yes, yes.
You know, it's an entertainer in, used to be Buckland's holiday camps. And a lot of the entertainers that ended up as big stars in variety in the United Kingdom started off as Butlins redcoats because of their red coats.
Yeah.
So you're right. Sorry, I interrupted you. I came out of the building.
Within days, though, extraordinarily, within days of seeing the photos, I mean, it may even have been the day after, as I recall, you met him in the flesh, you met Paul in the flesh.
Yes.
And I have to say, I don't think I've ever read a book by a public figure that so tenderly and honestly describes their relationship with their life partner, their husband. I mean, it's an extraordinary journey throughout the book, and he is a sort of equally vivid character in the book to you, Michael. And it's quite extraordinary because there's a candour to the way you describe your relationship and a love which is very apparent from the pages, you know?
Well, again, the candour with our... again, I pushed him away. I thought, if you love me, you've got to go. And then if someone as beautiful and as stunning as that couldn't love me and couldn't want to be with me, and so I successfully pushed him away, and we nearly split. And there's, even though I say so myself, there's a lovely scene that's of its time, experienced by so many people in same-sex relationships, where we were just about to split up, and then we head off to the local cafe in the market, and we sit there amongst the builders and the market traders, two men trying to keep their relationship intact, trying to be together, but pretending to all of the world that was observing that they were not together.
Yes.
And so when we developed that open relationship, it needed work. And a lot of people used to say, well, you're not a real couple because you have this open relationship. And what I learned through Paul is the difference between lust and love.
Yes.
And that you can't own someone. Yeah. You can love and be loved, but you cannot own. You can't own what's going on in somebody's mind. And I just, again, I wanted to say that relationships need working at. And one should design one's relationship.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be. If it's imposed by others, we end up living what they expect rather than what we experience.
You get a strong sense of having designed together a relationship that works for you. And you get a strong sense as well, I think, of teaching each other, during the relationship. There's a strong sense of learning from each other and growing from each other, which I think is just wonderful. And it comes across really every time you speak about the relationship.
Well, I'm so glad you picked that up, because we did. I learned so much from him, and I still do. And he learned so much from me, and that is the wonderful thing in a relationship, when you can have the trust and the courage to turn around and say, you know what, I'm frightened. I don't know how to do this. Yeah. Or these are my dreams. These are my hopes. And he and I were like a glove and a hand. He had this joy of spending money, and I had this fear of never having money, but later in life. And he'd say, let's do this. And I'd go, no. I'd say, no, think of the money. And he'd scream, spend it. And I'd cover my ears in mock horror going, nah. But that is the joy of a relationship, when you grow. And Alan Ayckbourn, I worked with Alan Ayckbourn. Alan directed my first play up there in Scarborough that you mentioned. And Alan said, all great relationships become great working partnerships. And the key word is working. You always have to work at it, and it's always, therefore, rewarding, frustrating, but it's developing.
So you were together when you took on the role for which I first became aware of you, which was Colin Russell in EastEnders. And I was in my teens at the time, and I knew I was gay. And I've got to say to you that the relationship between Colin and Barry in EastEnders became, for me, and I'm sure thousands of others, a signal, a public signal, really, of the kind of affirmation of your identity as a gay teenager, in my case. And to see on primetime television on the BBC, a gay relationship being lived out on screen was incredibly validating. How many times have you heard that, Michael? That must be something that you get told all the time.
I do get it. I am told it often. There was a guy recently at a book signing, and he said to me, I think he was 9 years old when I was on EastEnders, and he said, I knew I was gay.
Yeah.
He said, so I used to hide behind the sofa and watch you behind the sofa so that my parents couldn't watch me watching you. That time in EastEnders, 1986 to 1989, was a very, very dark period. The portrayal of gay men in particular, AIDS and HIV,
yes.
Been with us for some years and was described as the gay plague. They said that they depicted us as gay men as wanting to get into schools and promote homosexuality. The connection with gay men with paedophilia all the time was common in the press and amongst politicians who did know better but said otherwise. And it was a very, very dark period. So for the BBC to decide to have this very ordinary guy in the show, and then he turns out to be gay, and he has a young lover who's slightly below the age of consent, young working class lad, was incredibly controversial. And there were calls when it happened for my character to be taken out of the show. And when we developed the storyline, they said, if you don't take these characters out, then the show will have to be taken off. Yeah. But, Jeremy, what sums it up brilliantly for me was I used to keep all my letters for and the letters against in my dressing room on the windowsill. So I have a little barometer of how public opinion was, or how I thought it was, because what the BBC didn't tell me was they kept the worst negative letters away from me. Yeah. And so I kept these letters, but I got a letter from a woman, and she said, I watched the omnibus, because it used to be 2 episodes, the week's episodes used to be shown on a Sunday afternoon. And she said, I watched it with my 2 sons, and I think she said they were 7 and 9. And she said, and the eldest said to me, why is Colin kissing Barry? And she said, I said to him, well, as mummy loves daddy, so Colin loves Barry.
Wonderful.
And that absolutely personified for me why we were getting under the skin of the tabloids and those terrible right-wing politicians and those religious so-called spokespeople who should have known better. It's because it was coming over as love. It was coming over as something that people did with one another if they loved one another. So,
the news of the world, the bricks through the window. This must have been a time of incredible pressure for you and Paul and your public, public persona. That must have been a time of incredible pressure for you, actually. You get a sense in the book, Michael, that this is about the time, the kind of early 80s, where your political activism starts to really come to the fore, really. I mean, obviously, you talk about your hatred for Margaret Thatcher. You talk about your support for the miners because of you and Paul coming from, having a political commitment, and Paul coming from a mining community. I was struck by, reading the book, it seemed to me your first kind of, or at least the first description you give of your sort of campaigning is in relation to the judicial review against equity. I mean, there's a very early signal there, isn't there, of you taking a cause, grasping a cause and taking it forward. And clearly in the context of the politics of HIV at the time and Section 28 in particular, you get a very strong sense of that at that point, of you wanting to step forward and, really make it, really change things politically, really, as an activist,
Well, it's interesting. A friend of mine said to me, and she didn't know about me wanting to do medicine.
Yeah.
And she said, that was when it started, wasn't it? And I said, what? She said, public service. And that hadn't even occurred to me. But that activism, well, I think if you've got an imagination it was interesting. Michael Foot, who was the leader of the Labour Party many years ago, was once asked if Margaret Thatcher cared, and he said she has no imagination, therefore she can't.
Yeah.
And that early on, coming from my background, Paul coming from his background, if you saw an injustice and it affected you, it connected with you, you couldn't do or say nothing.
Yeah.
And I found a bag literally about 3 weeks ago, and I put it on Twitter, the contents, and they were all badges that I'd collected over the years of the Clause 28 marches and AIDS and HIV marches. And there was a badge from the Kent miners when we were out supporting them. And Section 28 happening when I was in EastEnders. Section 28, which the first anti-LGB law in 100 years, coming in during the AIDS pandemic. And I knew that if I didn't go on that march against Section 28 and I didn't speak out against Section 28, that I would never be able to look myself in the mirror again.
Yeah.
And going on that march led me to where I am now.
Yeah.
It's another part of that failure of the 11 plus, that there come moments in your life where if you don't accept them, then it's lost. There isn't another opportunity. And I didn't set out to become a politician. When I got that call when Margaret McDonough, who became Labour's first General Secretary, phoned me up and asked me if I'd consider going into European politics. I said, no, Margaret, no. And anyway, I'm sanding the floor. Because I didn't go to university. Yeah. I didn't come from that background. And I thought, no, other people go into politics. And again, it was Paul who said, what do you mean? You're mad. Go for it. Of course you can do it. But it came out of that period in EastEnders of standing up to the flack, the hatred that the tabloids hurled at us, the defamation and misrepresentation, and the same defamation and misrepresentation that trans people are facing now. Yeah. The fact that they face it from some lesbians and gay men and bisexuals and even from some other trans people makes it unforgivable. Yeah. If you allow it to happen to others, then your own history will repeat itself. And if I hadn't gone into EastEnders, that I wouldn't have led Section 28 with Ian McKellen. We wouldn't have formed Stonewall with people like Lisa Power and Ian. So you see how one step often falls naturally in front of the other.
But you're there when it comes to the time when government starts to change the law to bring in equality. You're there. You're there all those stages, and whether it's, as we used to call it at the time, gays in the military, or the equal age of consent, or repealing Section 28, or the idea that you had to bring forward the commitment in the Queen's speech to bring civil partnerships in. There's a strong sense of you're plugged into those discussions, and you're part of the of the context for all those decisions being made. Really, you really become, your political activism have become a very, very significant part of your life at this point, Michael. And so, looking back at that period, there was a sense, from the outside, of seeing these reforms happening year by year of things that we'd been hoping for and you'd been fighting for a long time. What did it feel like in that sort of 5 or 6 year period when these milestones of equality were coming in almost on an annual basis, really, because of the work that you and others were doing through Stonewall and after Stonewall as well?
To be honest, the feeling was, right, we've got this, now we must get the next bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly a feeling of euphoria. When I walked out of Downing Street that day, when I'd asked Tony Blair to bring the civil partnerships forward in the Queen's speech, and I won't give away how it works in the book, but hearing the traffic droning past and virtually walking on air, thinking, I must tell Paul, I must tell Angela Mason, who was the chief executive of Stonewall, but I think the reason why I was there, we set up Stonewall. And when we set up Stonewall, there was a lot of opposition from lesbian, gay, bisexual activists who believed that we shouldn't represent anyone. And we said, we're not. We're representing our view of the world. And we set out to convince politicians from all of the major parties that they had to deal with these issues. And then we would bring forward amendments. We would reason as to why it was in the long-term interests of the country, the long-term interests of the economy, of families, to be inclusive and to address the inequality and the discrimination, and always using the language of being reasonable and wanting to offer the solution. And I think for me, that is still the way. Here in my London borough, we're in the middle of COVID. They've had a review and they've decided to end Meals on Wheels. Well, a little bit of work that I do here in the community, I know that this is one thing we should be reintroducing, that people are vulnerable. People don't have the means to have a hot meal. And so it is that kind of... So the reason I'm saying this was when I talked to a politician about it today, a couple of politicians, I said, I'm eager to be part of the solution to this problem. And I think that is probably the strength of the changes that we managed to introduce, because we had a good media strategy. And equally, I have to pay tribute to Peter Tatchell and the people who were in outrage, because that was the direct action group. And in a way, the politicians and the others, the policy, the opinion formers, had two ways of doing it. Stonewall's nice, gentle, easy, reasonable way, or as Peter did, they'd jump up in the pulpit at Canterbury Cathedral and arrest the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that kind of dual approach, but always showing that your argument is reasonable. There's nothing unreasonable about equality. And I'll shut up on this point, because somebody said to me, why do you want an equal age of consent? I said, because it's about equality. I said, if you want to make the age of consent for heterosexuals 70, then I would argue for exactly the same, because I want to live with the same freedoms, the same rights, and the same responsibilities as others. It's as simple as that.
So those landmark reforms, they've changed, haven't they? They've changed the basis of equalities law for gay men, for lesbians, any member of the LGBT community. Well, not all parts of it, of course, with the trans community still fighting for many of their rights.
Yes.
But I think sometimes, I whenever I'm asked about these things, I say changing the law is the first step, not the last step in getting a properly civil society, a proper society which is genuinely inclusive. And so, what's your perspective on, having been there at the, winning the battles that you helped win along that period? What's your sense of what there needs to be done now to not just change the law, but to change people's kind of hearts and perceptions about our equalities and our rights as an LGBT community? Because actually, that hasn't. Not all of those battles have been won yet.
No. Well, first of all, for me, the key thing is connectivity. When I was in the European Parliament, I had the brilliant opportunity to work on anti-discrimination law across the whole of the EU. And the basis of what we did there formed the Equality Act here in the United Kingdom, that first step of non-discrimination in the workplace on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, belief, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender being covered elsewhere. And that list sums up for me what we need to be doing now. I need to be as concerned about what's happening to people because of a different color, a different race, ethnicity, religion, belief, whatever, as if it were me. That connection. Because people experience discrimination on so many different grounds, and to do nothing about one is to make redundant all the good you've done. because if I look at places, well, we've got to speak out so that when we travel, we have to say to the government, actually, what happens in Poland is as important to me, because even if I take a selfish view, right, say I work for BP and BP say, we want you to go and work in Poland. And I say, well, what happens to my husband, my same-sex husband, and my children? As soon as I land there, our rights go. And so the concept of our rights traveling with us means that we can introduce, once again, the universality of human rights, and the concept of what happens to the other is as if it's happening to you. I'm not religious. I'm a born-again atheist. But I am deeply concerned that some LGBT plus people can't be themselves within their religious communities where they feel that they naturally belong, and then sometimes face discrimination within the LGBT wider community because they're people of faith. And so speaking out on behalf of others, we ask people to speak out on behalf of us. It's implicit. But I am worried about what happens when the economy hits the buffers. There is never a full frontal attack on minority rights and human rights. There's always another reason, i.e. The employer needs to be able to employ who they want. The economy is in a bad way. That cake provider needs to decide who they supply their services to and who they don't. And post-Brexit, that is going to be compounding the economic problems. It won't be surprising for people to hear that I'm passionately European. I would be, wouldn't I, as a member of a minority coming out of a Europe that was born out of the ashes of the Second World War and crematoriums that were dotted around Europe, where people were worked to death and put to death because they were different. Of course, I'd be passionate about Europe, and I'd be insane if I wasn't. And so post-Brexit, when I won't have recourse to the European Court of Luxembourg on issues around the Charter of Fundamental Rights, because the government has opted completely out of that, that causes me concern. The fact that I won't be able to enjoy rights of a citizen anymore. I won't be a citizen. In fact, I'm not any longer. There isn't such a thing as British citizenship, English citizenship. You are a subject of the Queen. That's what the old passports used to say. And it may have missed me, but I haven't seen an Act of Parliament installing and instilling the concept of citizenship. So I am concerned, but that's why the House of Lords gives me a brilliant basis upon which to speak and often say things that people may not want to hear, and that's extremely important.
I want to talk to you about the House of Lords in a second, but 15 years in the European Parliament, you went in there with, a legacy of political activism and achievement going in there. What's the thing that you're proudest of your 15 years as a frontline politician with that kind of international canvas? What do you say to yourself? I did that. Well, I helped make that happen.
It's not writing the anti-discrimination laws or the action program to end discrimination on the grounds that I stated, nor writing the Schengen border code. I had the brilliant opportunity with a small group of parliamentarians to work to prevent a young 17-year-old gay Iranian from being deported from the UK back to Iran, where he would have been hung by his neck in a public square until he was dead. To be able to have played a tiny part in that is a privilege that will rest with me for the rest of my life.
You're in the House of Lords.
Am I?
Paul wasn't here to see you become a peer, become Lord Cashman of Limehouse. What's your plan in the House of Lords? What do you want to do? What do you want to change?
I'd love to change this water into wine at the moment. But, well, first of all, let me just wind back at the start of that 15 years. My brilliant friends, Neil and Glenys Kinnock.
Yes.
And Glenys said to me, she said, I know what you're like. She said, don't ever feel that you don't have a right to be here. She said, what you and I have brought to politics is the sum of our life experience, and nobody can match that. And that was the best advice that she could have given me. Paul died four days before I entered the house. He shared in the joy that we knew it was going to happen, and even until the day before, we were trying to plan ways to get him in to see me enter. I've had an opportunity to do a number of things, speaking out about LGBT plus rights in the rest of Europe, voting with others to make sure that the 4 billion of tax cuts for the most vulnerable did not go ahead. At the moment, I'm working on, I've got a private members bill to widen the pardons to those who were in the armed services, the posthumous pardons, because a lot of them have been missed out, and equally widening. I got an amendment accepted by the government so that we widen what we call the disregards of convictions for so-called homosexual crimes that are no longer crimes. Yeah. Soliciting, importuning, behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, all of those, and equally a pardon. The government's been very slow, despite the minister, whom I know personally is committed. So that is still going on. But again, I work around a whole range of issues. The EU, fundamental rights, AIDS and HIV. I put down some questions this week regarding the treatment of trans people, the gender reform of the Gender Recognition Act, about housing, community, all of the things that I'm passionate about, human beings. I can speak on those issues, and for those people who might otherwise be silenced. And it's a wonderful privilege. I've never worked in such a warm and welcoming place in my entire life. And the fascinating thing is it's so much like the European Parliament, because no one party has a majority.
Yes, yeah.
So therefore, you have to win the arguments, you have to win the debates, and you have to work with people cross-party. And I find that much more intellectually challenging and stimulating. Yeah.
Look, we're almost out of time. So I just want to ask you one thing before we close. Having read the book, which I found fascinating, I want to know what you think, what you feel is the proudest thing which you write about in your book, thing you're proudest of.
My love for Paul. Somebody said to me, you've written about things and your life in a way that's unimaginable. But you've also written a love letter to Paul. It's interesting the way the book begins and the way it ends. But to have been loved in such a way is to be changed forever. And hopefully, as the lyrics of Wicked say, changed for good.
Michael Cashman, actor, activist, politician, writer, one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.